There are forces in this world stronger than action, stronger than speech, stronger than confrontation. They're not visible, they're not loud, they're not celebrated, but they're everywhere, quietly shaping the destiny of people, relationships, even empires. That force is absence. The absence of a word when everyone expects one. The absence of a reaction when the room is waiting. The absence of an answer when someone is desperate for closure. We think words move the world. We think explanations resolve conflict. We think endings set us free. But the truth is this: what's left unsaid, unfinished, and unresolved has more power than what's spoken. The greatest philosophers, strategists, and mystics understood this, not because they read it in books, but because they saw how people suffer, not from pain itself, but from the endless need to know. The mind is addicted to closure. It can't stand the unfinished. A song that cuts off halfway haunts us more than one that ends badly. A story without an ending stays with us forever. Absence, then, becomes a weapon, a mystery, a spell cast not with sound, but with silence. Ask yourself, why do people reread old messages? Why do they replay old conversations? Why do they lie awake at night reliving moments from years ago? It isn't the event itself that haunts them. It's the gap, the missing piece, the unanswered question. Why did they leave? What did they mean? Was it my fault? The human mind can't leave these questions alone. They circle endlessly, gnawing at our attention. And while the body moves forward, the mind stays chained to what's unfinished. Closure is peace, absence is obsession. And obsession is where power begins. We live in an age obsessed with communication. Talk it out. Be transparent. Resolve everything. But here's the paradox. Every word you give frees the other person a little more. Every explanation you offer releases them from your influence. Every conclusion you provide cuts the thread that ties them to you. And yet, if you withhold, if you stay silent, if you leave the story unfinished, you live on in their mind. You don't become a memory, you become a haunting. This is the paradox of power. To speak is to end. To remain silent is to endure. A cruel insult can sting. A betrayal can wound. But both have shape, definition, clarity. We can fight them, name them, process them. Silence, on the other hand, has no edges. It can't be fought. It can't be answered. It can't be solved. And so it lingers. It spreads. It grows inside the imagination of the one who suffers it. A single unanswered question can torment more than 1,000 painful truths. That's why silence isn't emptiness. Silence is a mirror. In its absence, the other person fills it with their own fears, their own doubts, their own endless speculation. And speculation is always harsher than reality. Why does absence hold such power over the human mind? Why do people cling to silence more than to words? The answer lies in the machinery of the brain itself. Psychologists call it the Zeigarnik effect, the tendency of the mind to remember unfinished tasks more vividly than completed ones. When something is unresolved, the brain loops it endlessly, desperate for closure. That's why you remember the exam you walked out of halfway through more than the one you finished. That's why the argument that ended mid-sentence still burns brighter than the one that reached a conclusion. That's why the lover who disappeared without a word haunts you longer than the one who explained and walked away. The mind is a machine built to complete patterns, but absence breaks the pattern. And once the pattern is broken, the machine can't stop grinding. This is the hidden architecture of psychological power. Words free, absence enslaves. The person left without closure becomes a prisoner, not of you, but of themselves. They are trapped in their own speculation, their own obsession, their own endless search for meaning. And yet here's the irony. You're the one who benefits. Because while they search for meaning, you become the meaning. Think about relationships, not just romantic ones, but friendships, families, even professional bonds. The moment something is left unsaid, it begins to grow. The unanswered text, the missed call, the silent treatment. These things aren't empty, they're full of imagined explanations, imagined motives, imagined betrayals. That's why silence is one of the most devastating forms of punishment in human connection. More than shouting, more than insults, more than anger. Because while anger has direction, silence has none. When someone shouts at you, you know where they stand. When someone insults you, you know what they feel. But when someone says nothing, you're left wandering in a desert with no map, no compass, no destination. And it's in that desert that obsession grows. History, too, is shaped by absence. Consider diplomacy. When nations negotiate, silence can be deadlier than threats. A delayed response, a withheld statement, a refusal to explain. These create anxiety, fear, and speculation in the minds of opponents. Consider leadership. The greatest leaders understood the power of withholding. They spoke less than others. They revealed only fragments. They let absence work on the imagination of their followers, until silence itself became a source of authority. Consider art. What is suspense if not absence? What is mystery if not the deliberate withholding of information? The greatest novels, the most haunting films, the most powerful myths, they all thrive not on what is shown, but on what is hidden. Absence is not weakness. Absence is design. But why is absence so terrifying? Because at the heart of every human lies the fear of the void. We don't fear pain as much as we fear emptiness. Pain can be named. Emptiness cannot. When faced with silence, the mind rushes to fill the void. It projects its darkest fears, its sharpest doubts, its deepest insecurities. And in the end, it suffers more from imagination than from reality. Absence, then, isn't passive. It's active. It doesn't just withhold, it multiplies. It doesn't just end, it expands. To be absent is to let the other person fight themselves. Silence has never been neutral. Throughout history, it has been a tool, a weapon, even a form of enlightenment. The greatest minds, philosophers, rulers, mystics, understood its hidden force. Take Socrates. He is remembered for his questions, his dialogues, his relentless pursuit of truth. But what made his method so powerful wasn't what he said. It was what he withheld. He asked questions, but never gave final answers. He guided his students, but never resolved their doubts. His silence forced them to wrestle with their own ignorance. The Socratic method wasn't the transfer of knowledge. It was the infection of questioning. His students were never satisfied because the man they called the wisest in Athens never filled in the gaps. Socrates understood, to give an answer is to end the conversation. To withhold it is to make the conversation eternal. That is why his teachings survived his death. Silence preserved them. On the other side of the world, the Zen masters of China and Japan wielded silence in a different way. They gave their disciples riddles, koans, strange questions without solutions. What is the sound of one hand clapping? The student would meditate, struggle, even suffer, searching for an answer that didn't exist. The master remained silent. Why? Because silence was the teaching. The unanswered question was the path. Only when the student exhausted the mind's endless hunger for resolution could they glimpse something deeper, the space beyond thought. Here, absence wasn't cruelty, it was medicine. A bitter medicine, yes, but one that freed the spirit. Niccolo Machiavelli, often caricatured as a master of manipulation, also understood the power of absence. In The Prince, he advised rulers not to reveal their intentions, their motives, or even their emotions. For when the enemy knows what you want, he can resist you. But when he does not know, when you remain silent, he is paralyzed by speculation. Machiavelli recognized what kings and generals already practiced. Secrecy is power, because silence forces the other side to imagine everything and to prepare for everything. And when you prepare for everything, you exhaust yourself before the battle even begins. Even religion has grasped the force of absence. In Christianity, the silence of God has been both the deepest source of faith and of doubt. Generations of believers have asked, Why is God silent? Why does he not answer? And yet that very silence shaped centuries of theology, prayer, and philosophy. God's silence became the canvas on which humans projected their fears, their hopes, their longing for meaning. In Buddhism, silence is the highest teaching. When asked the ultimate questions, what happens after death? Is there a self? Is the universe eternal? The Buddha often remained silent, not because he didn't know, but because he understood. Answers bind the mind. Silence frees it. Even in art, the masters of storytelling and music have used absence as their sharpest tool. A great composer knows the pause between notes creates more tension than the notes themselves. A novelist knows what's left unsaid between characters matters more than what's spoken. A filmmaker knows the shadow is more terrifying than the monster revealed. Art lives not in what is shown, but in what is withheld. Across all of these, the philosopher, the mystic, the strategist, the artist, a common truth emerges. Silence is not emptiness. It is presence in disguise. It is the presence of imagination, of fear, of desire, of longing. It is the presence of the unknown. And the unknown is the most powerful force in human life. We live in an age of noise. The world is louder than ever. Constant notifications, endless scrolling, voices competing for attention. And yet, in this flood of sound, silence has not lost its power. It has only grown stronger. Because when everything is speaking, the one who withholds their voice becomes unforgettable. Consider modern relationships. In the age of instant messaging, the greatest cruelty isn't an insult, it's an unanswered message. The scene without reply, the call that fades into the void, the sudden disappearance, ghosting. Why does ghosting hurt so much? Because it denies the mind closure. It leaves the story unfinished. And as we've seen, the human mind is addicted to finishing stories. A breakup with words, no matter how painful, has boundaries. But absence has no edges. It expands in every direction, consuming weeks, months, sometimes years of thought. Ghosting, then, is not silence. It is psychological warfare. Even in the artificial world of social media, silence is power. The influencer who posts constantly may be seen, but they're easily forgotten. But the one who disappears for months, only to return without explanation, creates a storm. Mystery amplifies attention. Scarcity creates demand. That's why the most powerful figures online, whether by design or by instinct, use absence as part of their brand. They don't give everything away. They let imagination do the work. And imagination, remember, is louder than any voice. In business and politics, silence has long been one of the sharpest weapons. A skilled negotiator knows when to stop speaking, to make an offer, then sit in silence. The human brain cannot endure the void, so the other party rushes to fill it, often with concessions. Leaders use the same tactic. A delayed response, a refusal to clarify, an unanswered challenge. These create tension, speculation, and eventually, submission. The loudest person in the room may appear dominant, but it's often the quiet one, the one who watches, waits, and withholds, who controls the tempo of the entire conversation. Think of the most powerful people you know. Do they speak constantly? Or do they choose their words carefully, sparingly, strategically? Speaking less is not weakness. It is confidence. It shows that your silence carries as much weight as your words. True power is never desperate to explain itself. But here lies the paradox. The modern world fears silence more than any age before. We can't bear it. We reach for our phones at the first hint of stillness. We fill the air with chatter, the feed with updates, the mind with noise. Why? Because silence confronts us with ourselves, with the questions we avoid, with the emptiness we fear. And yet, it is precisely in that silence that our deepest strength lies. In relationships and negotiations in the digital world, you always face a choice. Do you rush to fill the silence, or do you let it breathe? The weak fill the silence because they cannot endure the discomfort. The strong allow it because they know the other cannot endure it either. To master silence is to master yourself, and to master yourself is to master others. Beneath all our conversations, beneath history, politics, and personal struggles, there is a deeper silence. It is not the silence of unanswered texts or clever negotiation tactics, or even religious mystery. It is the silence that surrounds existence itself. The silence before we are born. The silence after we die. The silence that lingers between the beating of our hearts. This silence is inescapable. It is the ground of being. All human fear at its core is the fear of death. And what is death if not the final silence? No words, no stories, no explanations, just absence, just the unknown. This is why we resist it with chatter, why we fill our lives with noise, rituals, achievements, distractions, to avoid hearing the silence that waits for us. But philosophers like Epicurus argued that death should not be feared. Where we are, death is not, and where death is, we are not. In other words, silence is not our enemy. It is simply the place we cannot follow. For centuries, theologians have wrestled with what they call the silence of God. Why does God not speak directly? Why does he not answer prayers with thunder, with miracles, with clarity? For some, this silence is proof of absence. For others, it is the ultimate test of faith. But perhaps silence is the answer. Perhaps the divine is not a voice among voices, but the silence in which all voices arise. Not the actor in the play, but the stage itself. To hear God, perhaps, is not to hear words, but to fall silent enough that the eternal becomes audible. And then, deeper still, is the silence at the center of our own being. Who are you? Beneath your thoughts, your desires, the endless voice in your head. If you sit long enough in silence, if you watch the mind chatter and burn itself out, you may discover something unsettling. The self you cling to, the identity you defend, is only noise. When the noise fades, what remains? Not a person, not a story, not an ego, just awareness, just the silent witness. This is the silence mystics and sages have called enlightenment. Not an achievement, not a revelation, but a return to what was always there, the silence that is you. So what do we do with all this? With the silence of history, of psychology, of death, of God, of the self? We learn to honor it, to practice it, to wield it not just as strategy, but as wisdom. Because silence is not emptiness. It is a canvas. It is potential. It is the ground upon which everything else appears. Noise may dominate the moment, but silence is eternal. As you return to your life, remember this. Every unanswered message, every unsolved mystery, every pause between words is not absence, but presence. Not weakness, but strength. Not void, but possibility. To live well is not to fear silence, but to walk with it, to let it sharpen your mind, deepen your relationships, and open your spirit to the vastness of what cannot be spoken. Because in the end, all wisdom begins and ends in silence.